Just to ensure you're in the right place, this is Designing Cross-Platform Applications on .NET Core. My name is Kevin Griffin. I have an email. I have a Twitter. Drink tickets for anyone who writes something nice about me on Twitter. Maybe, kind of, sort of, probably. There we go. I'm that handsome fellow over there. I run a company called SwiftKick. We specialize in software consulting and training services, not just in .NET, but a variety of languages and technologies. If you're interested in any sort of team training whatsoever, just feel free to give me an email. Or go to my personal website, kevgriffin.com. I used to write about stuff, but you know how most blogs are. You start the blog with good intentions. I'm going to write an article every single day. And then 3 months later, like, crap, I knew I forgot something. Part of SwiftKick, I grew up in the community. I got to where I am because of my community involvement and just being active. So one of my facets of starting SwiftKick was to give back to the community. And one of the things we do is a bi-weekly webinar series, which are free. They're great topics like you would see at something like CodeMash, but from the comfort of your home or office. If you're interested in knowing what we have coming up, I have a little bit.ly here. You can go sign up and get on our list. I do promise that I will not ask you for money right now. Maybe later. I'm kidding. I'm not going to ask you for money. I just want you to come see cool free content. Next week, we have a great speaker. Her name is Emily Freeman. She works for a company called Kickbox, and she's going to talk about email, because email is really exciting, right? But she's going to talk about email, how it goes from our email clients out through the interwebs, eventually into someone's inbox, which maybe not everyone understands how that happens. So that's her session. So, show of hands, who's been working with .NET since the 1.0s? All right, cool. So we're going to go on a little bit of a way back trip here. I call this the short oral history of .NET, which means it's one slide and me talking for about 50 minutes. Ready? All right, cool. All right, so .NET 1.0. The whole reason that .NET even became a thing was because Java sucked. I'm just going to say that. Because .NET wouldn't have happened if Java was open, right? If you don't know the history of the Java Microsoft thing, you've never had to use MS Java, or had to install or had to support MS Java. Java was a great language, was a great platform. You could build great applications on top of Java. And I know I'm sounding like Trump now, saying it was a great language. But Microsoft came in and said, this is really good stuff. We want to add more to it. And Java said, no, you cannot add stuff to Java. Microsoft, go away. And Microsoft said, okay, we'll go over here and we'll do our own thing. So that's eventually where C# came from, and that's where eventually .NET came from. And we have this whole history lesson of different .NET versions. And those of you who have lived through .NET 1, or really .NET 1.1, and made the jump to 2.0, know that this was a very difficult time. Because, not even so much from a development standpoint, from an IT system engineer standpoint, we hated .NET. In college, I worked in an infrastructure where we had to upgrade everyone up to .NET 2.0 to support a single application. But we still had to support 1.1 for other applications. They didn't live in ceremony on the same machine at the same time. Eventually, we got away from that, and we got new versions of the .NET framework that ran on top of the same CLR, the Common Language Runtime. So that's why I have everything indented. .NET 3.0 and .NET 3.5 still ran on top of the .NET 2.0 CLR. Jump a little bit farther into the future, we have the .NET 4.0 CLR, and that gave us great things like .NET 4.5, 6, 7, so on and so on and so on. These all have one common characteristic. Who wants to guess what it is? Yes! Boom! All Windows. You get a drink ticket. Not really. I'm sorry. I wish I had that kind of pool. These were all Windows. So if you were a .NET developer, you were a Windows developer. All you knew and ever understood in life was Windows. Well, the world didn't run on just Windows. There were other platforms. I know, it's an amazing thing out there. So what do we mean by cross-platform? Who wants to name a platform that's not Windows? Linux. Actually, it's like we planned that as my next bullet. So when you get into Linux, it's not just Linux as the operating system. You have flavors of Linux. You have distributions of Linux. You have Ubuntu. You have Red Hat. You have so Debian, which is or Ubuntu is the offshoot of Debian. You can build your own if you hate yourself and run Gentoo or something. There's a lot of Linuxes. Linux. I'm assuming there's a plural version of Linuxes out there. You have Mac OS X, or which, Sierra, High Sierra, Lion, Kitty Cat, all those. But you also have newer technologies, Docker. Who uses Docker out there? A couple of hands. So Docker is kind of the next big thing. If you want your next pay raise or your next six-figure job, go learn Docker. But we also have devices. I'm assuming everyone in here has an iPhone or Android device of some kind, right? If you don't, raise your hand. I see you're not admitting it. Who has a Windows phone? Really? And you admit it? You just got rid of your Windows phone? Windows Phone was a great platform that no one used. That's right. So you know what everyone says? You're absolutely right. But you know what every person I've ever talked to with a Windows Phone, how they defend it? Well, I don't need apps. I don't need apps. I'm like, then why do you have a smartphone? Just get a candy bar phone. It does the exact same thing. All right. So we have mobile devices, and then we also have our Internet of Things, our refrigerators and our stoves. These are going to start having apps on them because why not? And a great example is Tizen. I forgot how you pronounce it. Tizen? Yeah. Well, I would eventually got to that. And you can find these on things like Samsung appliances. And these all run .NET Core, and that's really cool. So you might have asked during this entire oral history of .NET, where does Mono fit in? And Mono is really cool because back when .NET was coming up, obviously it was just Windows, but Miguel de Casa, I always forget how to say his last name. Doesn't matter. He says, well, why can't this be on Linux or Mac as well? So the C# specification, that's all open. You could go grab it and write your own C# compiler if you wanted to. There's nothing Microsoft is going to do to stop you. The .NET framework belonged to Microsoft. That was closed source. But Miguel said, well, let's write an open source implementation of C# compiler, and let's build .NET implementations on other platforms, or something that's a little bit more cross-platform. And eventually, if you've been paying attention, Mono eventually got picked up by Microsoft, and now Miguel works for Microsoft as part of the .NET Core implementation. Although he's working more with the Xamarin stuff now. But this kicked off the revolution towards .NET being not just Windows. So let's fast forward to where we are now today. And we have this new crazy idea called the .NET Standard. What you need to understand about the .NET Standard that no one at Microsoft has been able to discuss in a good, easy to understand way is that the .NET Standard is a set of contracts that let's just think about it this way. If you write code that says, I want to call system.diagnostics.traceLine or trace.writeLine, we've all written that line of code in some way, shape, or form. If I write that line of code, that method call, that class, that namespace will be available on Windows, it will be available on Linux, Mac, Docker, so on, so on. That's what .NET Standard says. So if you're writing an application, if you're writing in a class library, if you're writing anything, and you say, I am targeting the .NET Standard version, name your version, you're agreeing that you will support or you will have access to a certain number of APIs. Currently, .NET Standard 2.0. When I first developed this talk and started pitching it around to different conferences, we were at .NET Standard 1.6, which this wasn't so much a how does it all work? It's more of a you're not going to be able to do anything talk. .NET Standard 1.6 had nothing in it, nothing useful. You could write a basic ASP.NET application, and that was about it. Things you couldn't do in .NET Standard 1.6. You couldn't send email. You know why you couldn't send email? Because you couldn't talk to an SMTP server. Why couldn't you talk to an SMTP server? Because they didn't have socket support. Kind of useful. So the great thing was I didn't find this out in an application until about 4 months in. When we started writing we had stubbed out all the email functionality and said, we'll just go add the email functionality when we're ready. Go in, start writing our email functionality, realize I can't use SMTP clients. Why can't I use SMTP client? It's not there. Why is it not there? It should be there. This is a very obvious thing that should be in .NET. And you find an issue on GitHub that says, oh yeah, we don't have sockets, so we can't send email via SMTP. Okay, plan B. Move on to something else. In .NET Standard 2, that's fixed. We have sockets now. And the other great thing about .NET Standard 2 is it is now possible for us to bring legacy, let's call them legacy, libraries and dependencies into the new generation. When we were running in .NET Standard 1.6, because it was such a limited number of .NET APIs that were supported, I couldn't go back to code I wrote in 2005 and bring it into the current century, or the current decade. Sorry, I'm getting my words mixed. It's been a long conference. Well, with .NET Standard 2, because there's so much more support, we could go back to old code that's just sitting around and is never going to be updated. We could pull it in to our current generation application, and it should, quote, should work just fine. Maybe. Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Have you all ever seen this chart before? All right, do you understand what this chart means? All right, one person. You get a drink ticket. All right, so this chart, what you really want to pay attention to, if you're running cross-platform applications, you really want to pay attention to the very top. And what this is going to tell you is, depending on a certain level of .NET Standard, what version of other languages and frameworks do you need to run to be compatible with .NET Standard? So let's say you're writing something greenfield, something brand spanking new, and you're targeting .NET Standard 2.0. We'll go all the way over here. Now, let's assume it's not an ASP.NET application. Let's assume it's a class library. And you want your class library to support not just .NET Core, .NET Standard, but you want to run this on Xamarin or Universal Windows Platform. Well, you just move your finger down the list and it will tell you, to support Xamarin for iOS, you need to run at least version 10.14. I don't do Xamarin development, so I really don't know what any of these versions mean. But then for Universal Windows Platform, look, you need some so major, minor revision, revision. So you need to run revision 16.299, which is not bad because we can go back a little. But let's say you're that Windows Phone guy, there's no support at all. And even worse, you're still supporting Silverlight, which is not supported at all on any of these versions of .NET Standard. You could do .NET Standard 1 and still do Silverlight. Anyone want to know the little secret why? That's right. So the Silverlight, as much as people hate Silverlight now, Silverlight is the reason that we have .NET Core, because it is essentially a fork of the Silverlight libraries. Silverlight was designed as a portable cross-platform .NET implementation. It didn't do anything, but it was a good starting point. But basically, they never went back and fixed Silverlight. They just kept moving forward. So if you don't want to support .NET Standard 2, you have to go back to .NET Standard 1.6. That's the most likely candidate. The thing you have to remember, you have to know about .NET Standard 1.6 is it really didn't do much. This was a subset of features that were available in .NET Framework. So if you, and it also added a couple new things. So if you wanted to run on top of .NET Full Framework, which you could, and you can still do that now, you'd have to run at least .NET Full Framework 4.61 to get the feature set that would be in .NET Standard 1.6. So this is meant to be a reference more for library developers or class library developers. If you're just building a line of business app, I would just move my finger all the way to the right and start working from there. All right. .NET Standard is not perfect. We're getting better, though. I already mentioned before, it doesn't support all the .NET Framework APIs. It's a lot better than it was in older .NET Standard. I've already said that. If you were to accidentally call something in an API that's not supported by your current platform, because you have to remember, this is a standard that will work on every platform that says it supports .NET Standard 2.0. But that's .NET Standard 2.0 on Windows, on Linux, on Mac, on Docker, on mobile, on this, on that. So anytime they add something to .NET Standard, you have to update however many dozen versions of that executable. Well, let's say you try to use something that's it's in .NET Standard, but it's supported on Windows, but not supported on Mac. You're going to get this nasty exception, platform not supported. I believe the only cases where they have documented this to occur is around cryptography or some weird bitwise CPU math, just because Windows does things differently than other Linux-based systems. I don't even have a good example off the top of my head to say, don't ever call this method because platform is not supported. But in this move to make things cross-platform, we're completely rethinking how a .NET application is built from the ground up. If we go back 5 years, heck, we could go back 3 years. When we were developing just .NET 4.0, .NET 4.5 applications, there was no concept of .NET Core yet, at least that was public. You deployed an application to a machine, you had to guarantee you had .NET on that machine. And that was part of your requirements. I'm going to deploy this web app to a machine that has .NET 4.5 installed. You had the entire framework at your disposal. It wasn't something that was just sitting around. Well, on top of that, if it was an ASP.NET application, you already knew you had ASP.NET on the machine. You had everything you needed. You just had to write code and write in the hooks. Well, now, because we don't want to, because now we have to support this on multiple platforms, if you're on the .NET team, you don't want to have to redistribute a several hundred megabyte file every time there's a slight little update. The way you counter that is with libraries and not the entire framework. So for an ASP.NET Core application, when I set one up, I might have a .NET Core executable of runtime on the machine that's capable of taking assemblies, building them all together, and running them as one cohesive thing. But I don't have a full framework installed on the platform. Which means if they update ASP.NET, I don't have to download 300 megabytes of .NET framework. I just download probably like 8 megabytes of ASP.NET changes. And I can keep my application in sync instead of worrying about the full framework. Everything's getting better. If you look at the roadmap for .NET Standard, they have a list of APIs that they're looking to support. And because it's an update to a standard, it's not something that they're going to roll out week to week to week. This is more of a every couple months to every couple months. So I would assume, and I'm not saying this as an MVP, knowing any inside information, I'm assuming that when build comes up in the next couple months, that they'll probably have a new version of .NET Standard ready to go. Whether or not it's .NET Standard 3 or just .NET Standard 2.5, we don't know. If you look at the number of APIs that were supported in .NET Standard 1, it was about 8,000, which in the grand scheme of things is not a lot. This is just some basic functionality so we can run a web application that knows how to process MVC calls and web API calls. I believe it's number of functions. So there's not a number of classes, not a number of namespaces. In .NET Standard 2, that number is closer to 33,000 and growing. One of the nice things about making the jump to .NET Standard 2 is they're looking at legacy APIs and determining, do we really need to bring this stuff over to .NET Standard 2? And that's where your feedback comes as developers in this space. Is you say, hey, .NET folks, there's this thing I use. I'd really like to use it in .NET Standard 2.5. Can you add it for me? And there's usually a logistical reason why they can or cannot. And I'm going to reiterate this again. You have to remember that these are supported everywhere. Every one of these 32,000 methods is supported on Windows, Linux, Mac, Docker, so on, so on, so on. And .NET Standard is truer, blah, blah, blah. So when we talk about applications, cross-platform applications in .NET Core, we have to kind of focus the discussion. We're talking web applications primarily. ASP.NET, or really any web application that you could possibly write on top of .NET Core. We're talking console applications, or some sort of service workers that can work behind the scenes. We're not talking Windows services, because remember the translation has to go from Windows to Linux to Docker to so on and so on. And there's not a good, currently, there's not a good translation story. Yes? You can write, yes, you can use .NET Standard on full framework to write Windows services. That's fully supported, but you're not going to move that to a Linux machine. Okay, because I tried. I specifically, when I wrote this slide, I was having a discussion with a couple other people going, "What? Can we make this work?" There's a library out there called Top Shelf, which makes writing Windows services really easy, and they're working on this problem. And I haven't checked their GitHub in a little bit, but they've had a whole thread discussing how do we make Top Shelf a cross-platform library. Yeah, the question, yes. Well, it's the difference between a Windows service and a daemon service, or a counterpart on another system, because you have an ecosystem that's different in each operating system for running background services, making sure that if they crash, that they restart themselves, and they have to be able to run without a user logged in or under their own sort of identity, which, if we're coming from a .NET point of view, is a completely different workflow than what I would have done on a Linux machine. Not saying it can't be solved, it's just not solved right now. Yes, sir. I will, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Now, what you could do, so the way that you could probably do this yourself is really to write it as say a console application, and you could write your own wrapper on, say you need to support Linux or Mac. You write your own wrapper to run that in the background on another OS. So I'm not saying it's impossible to do the same it's not impossible to do the concept. It's just not out of the box for you yet. You're not writing just a .NET command line that builds a Linux service for you. That's not happening right now, but maybe in the future. We're also not talking GUIs. So it's a even harder problem in Windows services. How do you take a WinForms app or a UWP app or something XAML-based and translate it on Linux or Mac? Because let's look at Linux. Linux, you can choose your own windowing environment. How do they go? No, you're running, KDE or GNOME or so on, or some of these offshoots. They kind of have to pick one and say, well, we only support these two on Linux. On Mac, you have to support, Cocoa and it doesn't matter. So how do you take XAML or, say, WPF, UWP-based code and make that translation in a cross-platform way? Because they're not going to add it to the standard unless they can support all these platforms. What you'll probably have to do is you'll have to go you'll have to write a class library and then go write a special implementation on the platform that you're trying to support. But right now, this stuff is not built into .NET Standard, .NET Core. All right, what I want to do, all right, timing is just right. I want to show you, I was just going to walk through the workflow of being the developer that works in a cross-platform environment. And when, in a previous life, I worked on a startup, and our entire system, our backend system, was written in Node.js. I know I had a phase. But it was a great environment to work in because I was on Windows, my business partner was on a Mac machine, and our deployment was in Linux. It was fantastic because I would work on code, and he would work on code. We would commit to GitHub. Our build system would take it and deploy to our Linux servers. And it was fantastic. And what I want to do is I want to show that we could do the same thing with .NET. And it doesn't require any code changes. There's no preprocessor ifs that say, if you're running on Windows, do this. If you're running on Linux, do that. It's going to be really simple. It's just a out-of-the-box ASP.NET Core application. But I'm going to do 3 things. And so this is our action plan. First, I'm going to create the app in Windows. No Visual Studio, just command line and VS Code. Pop that up in the GitHub. Move over to a Linux machine that has .NET Core installed. And I'm going to take the same code down, or pull the same code down. We're going to run it, and there's no code changes. You're going to say, Kevin, that's not very impressive. Show me something impressive. I will take that same code running on Linux. I will do some magic. I will move it to a machine not running Linux. And I will run that code. I will run that .NET code without having .NET Core installed. You all will stand up, applaud, throw roses at me. Deal? All right. Everyone's like, yeah, no, Kevin. All right. What was that slide? All right. Yep, we're not doing that yet. Okay. Let's see. Oh, hey, Ninja Cat. I don't want to run in extended mode. Let's go duplicate. All right. So I have 2 VMs just to prove. So I have an appropriate label. One is Ubuntu with .NET Core. The other one is Ubuntu without .NET Core. And I'm going to not use any of those yet. Let's minimize my slides. I am the command line, and I've already created a folder. I've already created a GitHub repo, but if I look in it, there's really nothing but a git ignore. So let's create a brand new ASP.NET MVC application. If you're jumping into .NET Core, get used to command line. I do a lot from the command line now, whereas I used to be an IDE junkie. I'll say .NET new MVC. This will go create the templates automatically. It'll also restore any of the dependencies that I need. So if we take a look at what we have, I have a full ASP.NET application. Well, let's jump in. And I want to show you the CS Proj file, which should hopefully not be new to anyone. If you've worked with .NET for any period of time, you've been in a CS Proj file, and they're usually scary. They're complicated. There's a lot in there. If you worked with .NET Core in the 1.0 days, you know that we moved from CS Proj over to Project JSONs, and then someone said, no, we can't do that. We have to go back to CS Proj. So we looped back around to CS Proj files. But now CS Proj files are really easy. They're simple because they only contain the necessary things that we need to know about our product. Up here at the top, line number 4, I have a target framework. And this targets what's called .NET Core App 2.0. Effectively, this is .NET Standard 2.0. And then after that, I have on line 8 my package references. These are NuGet packages. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about packages and dependencies here in a moment after I've brushed off all the roses. And then there's other meaningless stuff that we don't care about. But if you want to add packages to your application, this is where you do it. If you're building a class library or something that's going to work across multiple, not just multiple environments or platforms, but you need to support older versions of .NET or .NET Standard, you can actually add a comma inside of target framework, and you can add additional frameworks. And when it builds, it'll build for every framework that you have in that target framework. Now, that sounds a lot easier than it really is, because now you have to go in and prepare your code to compile against multiple frameworks. I'm not going to do that because that is an exercise in pain. But what I am going to do is go out to my command line and say .NET run and convince you all that this actually does what it's supposed to. There are. So yes, I don't remember how to do them. That's an easy to Google thing. Yeah. All right. So to prove that this actually does what it's supposed to, we can open up Chrome and go to our web page. I know that, and this isn't meant to be an impressive demo. The impressive demo is coming. All right. So we have our code. Now we want to go and do a commit. I already have a GitHub repo created. So yay. You all could go pull this code. I don't know why you would, because you can just say .NET new. All right. So to prove that there's nothing in there, I refreshed. Let's close out. We'll say git add everything, git commit hello. All right. I have to add my remote, and we'll say git push u origin. Oop. I did that. Sure. I'll show you how I made my git ignore. I go to a site called getignore.io. And I type in Visual Studio Code. And this tells me everything that should be in my gitignore. It's getignore.io. Here, I'll zoom in on it. There we go. They also have a command line, so you could just say at the command line, I'm building this application, I need a gitignore. All right, so if I refresh, all right, this has stuff inside of it. I'm going to move over to my Linux VM with .NET Core. Let's go full screen. I will zoom in as necessary. I'm running in Hyper-V, and Hyper-V just really sucks for integration. Let's open a console, and oh, I forgot to bump up that font. You know, little things. I forgot where you go to set. There we go. Nope. Crap. All right. Here's what we're going to do. We'll do it just like that. I'll zoom in. All right. To prove I have .NET, I can type .NET. .NET shows up. I'm going to go into I have a projects folder. And inside of projects, I have an old project, but I'm not going to use that. We'll say git clone, HTTPS, github.com/1kevgriff, and this is cm002.git. All right, I have the entire package. So now I can go into number 2. We see everything that's inside of it. And I will say .NET restore, because I need to go get the Linux version of all the packages, which I just had one. If I go into CS Proj, so it's the same CS Proj, and zoom. All right, and zoom. There we go. I had this ASP.NET Core.all, which is just a package that has a bunch of other package references. If I didn't put this in, I would have to have maybe 10 to a dozen different package references. So package or .NET Restore went and got this package and all of its dependencies, which means I can now come in and all right. There we go. I'm sorry? I think always. Yeah. All right, so I have everything. Let me go out to the command line, and we'll just say .NET run. All right, so the app is running to prove I am not lying. I'm going to say localhost port 5000. Okay. And all right, page loads. That's not when you applaud, folks. Hold your applause for the real awesome. I appreciate your enthusiasm. Okay. Now, before I move on to the next demo, I want to talk about runtime identifiers. So there's a page on Microsoft on Docs Microsoft for runtime identifiers, and this is for deployment purposes. When you're deploying a .NET Core application, you should really tell .NET Core what environment that it's deploying to. What environment are you targeting? And this lets you do a thing that no one talks about, but is amazing, that you can build self-contained .NET Core applications. Let me show you the demo. I'm going to go back into my code, and up here, I'm going to add a property called Runtime Identifier. And I'm going to set this runtime identifier to Ubuntu x64. I'm going to hit save, go back out to the command line. I'm going to write a complicated command that I write down because I always forget it. There we go. It's this guy right here. And I'm going to tell .NET Core, .NET, I want you to publish a self-contained assembly that targets Ubuntu x64. You should, yeah. I haven't experimented trying to build it off on a different platform. Like I haven't tried building this on Windows yet. I think you're still limited by the environment that you're running on. But this is more for a build system than you doing manually. When it's all done, it's going to tell me, hey, Kevin, go to this path, and here's all your files. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to cheat a little bit and go home, project, CM2. It's under bin, debug, .NET Core, Ubuntu, publish. All right. I want this entire folder, so I'm going to copy. And syncing files out of Hyper-V is a pain in the butt. So I have Dropbox installed. I'm going to create the folder CM02, and I'm going to paste everything in there. So that's currently syncing, and Wi-Fi is working, so we could applaud for that. All right. So let's go ahead and shut that down. Now, while that's going, I'm going to switch over to my other VM, and log into it. All right, and that's currently pulling the new files down. But instead of waiting for it, I'm going to show you the version I've already synced, and that's in Dropbox CM01. Now, no, it's in Dropbox CodeMash CM01. Okay, there's a lot of files in here. Because what I did was when I said .NET Publish as a self-contained, it went through my entire project, it went through my dependencies and said, what is every single little thing that we need to make this run on an environment that does not have the specific version of .NET Core that we need. So it gives me every single thing that I need to run my application. There's a lot of crap in here. And also, when I was talking about, we're now talking about libraries instead of full frameworks. These are all the libraries necessary to run my application. Before, this would have just been a .NET framework installation. Here's my views folder, but then there's all this stuff, and if I scroll up, there is. I'll show you. Well, no, not .NET binary. I do have CM01, which is my executable. It's my library. Now, let me go ahead and move this up. I'm going to show you first things first. .NET, command not found. .NET Core is not on this machine. When I built this machine, it was Ubuntu install, run updates, nothing else. No .NET. I'm going to run CM01. It's running. So now if I go to Firefox, we'll say localhost 5000. Wait. There we go. Now you throw roses and stuff like that. So actual places I have used this, I had an application. It was being really weird. I was trying to deploy it to Azure Web Jobs. And whatever I was trying to do, it wasn't properly running in Web Jobs. It said, this file is missing, that file is missing. And it turns out that there's stuff that's not supported in the installation of .NET Core in the Web Jobs framework. And so what I did was I built a Windows self-contained version of my service, and I deployed that, and magically everything started working. It was fantastic. So this is a great way to kind of future-proof your applications from a deployment standpoint, because you just deploy everything that's necessary to run your application. You don't have to worry about dependencies already being on the machine. You had a question, sir? I can't quite hear you, so I'm going to walk a little bit closer to you. No, you're fine. If you run it in the background, you can run a couple commands and tell it to run in the background. It's using Kestrel. So it's using Kestrel, which is pre-baked into it. So the question, if you all didn't hear them, was what am I using for a web server? And that's Kestrel. That's built by the ASP.NET team. And at the current moment, Kestrel is a battle-hardened, well, it's not battle-hardened, it's hardened web server. So you can run SSL on it. It has backlogging. It has major web server stuff. I would still recommend that if you're doing an ASP.NET app, you run this behind something else. Nginx, not really Apache, HA proxy. Run Kestrel behind something else just for that added protection. But you can install those separately. You don't have to have .NET Core installed. So it all should, quote, work. Okay, so yay, that was Kevin's awesome demo. Last things I'd like to talk about is just how do you, so you're going cross-platform, what things should you worry about? Because I deployed just a basic ASP.NET Core application. And you all know well enough that your applications don't stop there. because you build the scaffold of what your application is going to look like, and then you have to add dependencies. And dependencies are where you will most commonly screw up. You will bang your head against the wall because you have to rely on your dependencies to support the level of .NET Standard that you are supporting. And they're not all created equal. I'm going to show you two examples, a good example and a bad example. JSON.NET. We've all heard of JSON.NET, correct? Just a little bit popular. James Newton King is a really nice guy. He's really short, though. So if I go to NuGet.org, let's go look at JSON.NET. We're going to come down here, and we're going to look at dependencies. And one of the nice things about NuGet is it tells you targeted frameworks and also what dependencies are required under those targeted frameworks. Looking at JSON.NET is a masterclass in how do you build a cross-platform library. So we can go all the way back to .NET Standard 2.0 if you need support for that. But then we can come all the way to .NET Standard 2.0 and also portable class libraries for Silverlight and Windows Phone. Well, if I'm starting an application, so .NET Core App 2.0 implements .NET Standard 2.0. You say 2.0 a lot. Well, if I install JSON.NET, I can guarantee it will work, and it will not complain at all. Everything that JSON.NET needs to do will be efficient. I'm going to show you another library. This is one I'm actually dealing with right now, called closed XML. And closed XML was really great when we were focused primarily on a full .NET framework. And it was an easy way to build Excel files and PowerPoint files and stuff like or Excel files. Well, there's a big problem with closed XML. It only currently supports .NET Framework 4.5. If you remember from our chart, .NET 4.5 is way, way back on the .NET Standard scale. So I can pull this into my application, my .NET Standard 2.0 application. I can pull this in, and I do, but it will only run under .NET Full Framework. I cannot deploy my application with closed XML to a Linux machine or to a Mac because their versions of .NET Standard don't support, they can't install .NET Framework. So this does not get supported. If I try to install it, it will yell at me. It might try to work, but it will yell at me. So this is something where if you're a user of it, you can do one of two things. You can go to the project page and say, hey, why don't you support .NET Standard 2.0 and do the work for me? Or you could clone the project and do the work yourself. Now, in its defense, closed XML does not support .NET Standard 2 because they're waiting on other libraries to support .NET Standard 2. It's like a hierarchy chain of, well, I can't do it until he does his job. He can't do his job until she does her job, and so on and so on and so on. So once all the stars align, they will eventually support .NET Standard 2.0. And there's a very active GitHub issue talking about this right now. But you need to keep in mind, if you install this and you try to deploy to a Linux machine, it's not going to work. You're going to have a bad time. So little things. Yes? So they could try. So they could pull the code down. They could try to build it against a higher version. You might still run into issues going because OpenXML's dependencies might not compile against 4.6.1. And still, you don't know until you try to run it on another machine, will it all work? Now, there is a tool. If you have your own dependencies, that you can try. Microsoft will tell you, does this work on .NET Standard? What do you need to change to support .NET Standard? And it's called the Portability Analyzer. I call it Will It Blend for .NET Standard. And it is a tool that you install either at the command line or as an extension in Visual Studio. So if I come in here, say portability, yeah, so .NET Portability Analyzer. What it does is it builds your application, then it goes through and reflects over every method call that you use, and every class, every namespace, and it says, okay, I know what you're using from a .NET Core, .NET Standard standpoint, is what you're doing supported. And it'll give you back a list of files that say, well, this is supported, this is not supported, and sometimes it's even better. It'll say, this is not supported, but you could change your line of code to say this. And it does the exact same thing, it's just in a supported manner. Now, I saved this for absolute last because the demo gods were not with me today. I have a class library I wrote a very long time ago for a client. It's an open source library. And I wanted to reflect over it to see, is it compatible with .NET Standard 2? So I have it in here. I already have Portability Analyzer installed. When you install Portability Analyzer, you can set some options. Let me zoom in here. So I can tell it what kind of outputs I want. The Excel's not very useful. The HTML document's useful. You can also get back JSON. I'll talk about that why in a second. But then you can talk about the platforms you wish to target. Because maybe you don't want to just target the latest, 2.0, 4.7, 2.0, so on and so on. You can come in and select older versions, newer versions. If you're JSON.NET, you select everything because you need a view across the board of everything that needs to get supported. If you do that and say, okay, so notice there's Windows Phone, there's Xamarin versions, and I'm going to run, so analyze project portability. So I ran this yesterday, it worked great. Today, I think their server's down because demo gods will say, no, yeah, it's sent it up to a web service, which is not useful at all. I thought it was an internet issue, and it's not. It's a web service issue. So they're throwing errors for some reason. But what this does is it gives me an HTML file, and the HTML file, if I had been thinking, I would have had one just stowed away, ready to look at. Instead, I deleted it like a sucker. But it would give you a list of here is every namespace and method or namespace, class, and method used in your application. Is it supported or is it not? And it just uses green, yellow, red to give you a view. Now, one thing you might want to do is if you're building this and you want to make it future-proof, add it to your build process. So you can get back a JSON file, and as part of your build process or build script, you could say, well, let's build it. Let's run it against Portability Analyzer as a command line script. Let's pull the JSON back, and let's look at the JSON for anything that's not 100% supported. And maybe that becomes a build warning or someone gets an email for some reason. And that future-proofs you moving forward. Or if it's something that you're continuously working on, you might have a developer, not you, but one of your coworkers, might add something that's not supported on one of your target frameworks or target platforms. Well, this protects you against that because it might break the build. Well, Bob, you used WriteLine, and WriteLine's not supported on Mac in .NET Standard 2, so go fix the build. So that's really useful if it worked, but I highly recommend it. Yes, yeah. So if you go back to code from 2005, you build it, you want to make sure, well, can I move this to .NET Standard 2? And if you can, it's just almost a matter of recompiling the project. But this will tell you, oh, you're using this weird cryptography class that we don't support anymore. we haven't moved that over. And that's usually the case. It's something mundane like cryptography or weird math. Most stuff is supported. But that is highly useful. But with that, I have about 5 minutes remaining. I want to thank you all for coming out. And if you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free to stick around. If not, I will move out into the hallway. But I hope you've all enjoyed CodeMash. And 5-star ratings, don't worry about it if you're going to rate me less than that. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.